Guys, your favorite actor, Senpai Reacts, and we finally back for this week's videos. We got a lot of videos to catch up, so today we're gonna be reacting to the rest of the XG Tape 4s, Maya, Jurin, and Kakuna. Super excited. Check out the Harvey one I did. I believe it was last week, and we're gonna check out the rest of them today. Then we also got a new track from all four of them, I believe. So let's jump into the tapes. Then the other song would probably be a separate video. So let's jump into them. Yeah.
Walk in the building feeling like $1,000,000 and go out with a bang. This ain't a stick up, but they got the hands high like I'm robbing a bank. Girl gang get zeros and commas. Yeah, I'm taking in $1 language. I'm not going backwards, no, I'm not going on. F to the L to the E to the XG. Never with the technique. Run it up, check me. Opposites in the comments don't attract me. Are you not from this planet? Unidentified, intergalactic, we're landing. We come in peace, but don't test my girls to turn to a battalion. Destination manifesting, no hesitating, on no time for resting. I spit like this, but look like that. To some of y'all, it must be a complicated complexion. Could it be the X genetics? So could it be I'm sick of the same script for gimmicks? So could it be just sick of me elevating my skill? Well, I hate to push a bubble, but I'ma pop the limits. Okay. Word of advice, always give it 100. Yeah, that's a big tip for your life. Right? If pressure keep pressing my buttons, and I just let it detonate on a mic.
Yeah, I really love her like flow because when she raps, she just keeps going and going and just going, and you just like waiting for her to stop, but she don't stop. She just keeps rapping and rapping and rapping.
Sign language. I'm not going
Then she got bars.
I'm not going on. F to the L to the E to the XG. Never with the technique. Run it up, check me. Opposites in the comments don't attract me. Are you not from this planet? Unidentified, intergalactic, we're landing. We come in peace, but don't test my girls to turn to a battalion. Destination manifesting, no hesitating, on no time for resting. I spit like this, but look like that. To some of y'all, it must be a complicated complexion. Could it be the X genetics? So could it be I'm sick of the same script for gimmicks? So could it be just sick of me elevating my skill? Well, I hate to push a bubble, but I'ma pop the limits. Okay. Word of advice, always give it 100. Yeah, that's a big tip for your life. Right? If pressure keep pressing my buttons, and I just let it detonate on a mic. Leave it on pause on the positive vibes. Everything else, the don't comply. Only she's throwing her in front of my eyes. Yabba, yabba, yabba. Walk in the building feeling like $1,000,000 and go out with a bang. This ain't a stick up, but they got the hands high like I'm robbing a bank. Girl can't get zeros and commas. Yeah, I'm taking in $1 sign language. I'm not going backwards, no, I'm not going on.
Maya. Okay, next we gonna jump into Still Hot, Jurin.
Sure, you know what you're doing.
Last time I checked, yup, still hot. Still got the fire flame flavor, can't stop, won't stop. Jurin a real problem on the mic, blast off. When I rock it, I ain't 5'9", but this little giant knows what's really than hip-hop. Call it what you want, X-pop, stirring up the pop. Woo, standing on some business, down on my 10 toes, is walking out in for scary, that room about to raise a roof. I don't want no beef unless it's Kobe great. And while you process it, I keep it raw, no kayfabe. They talking way out of pocket, out of the unpaid rate. Go ahead and get it off your chest, but you ain't no shay. Ha, too rare with a clarity, top integrity. Graduate.
Go ahead, get it off your chest, but you ain't no shay. I don't know if that's a reference to Shannon Sharp interview podcast, Club Shay. I don't know if that's a reference. I don't know if she watches that or like know about that, but if it is, then that's fire.
Jurin a real problem on the mic, blast off. When I rock it, I ain't 5'9", but this little giant knows what's really than hip-hop. Call it what you want, X-pop, stirring up the pop. Woo, standing on some business, down on my 10 toes, is walking out in for scary, that room about to raise a roof. I don't want no beef unless it's Kobe great. And while you process it, I keep it raw, no kayfabe. They talking way out of pocket, out of the unpaid rate. Go ahead and get it off your chest, but you ain't no shay. Ha,
she is talking about it, but you ain't on shay.
Get them shook and settling, and I always decide for the beat, no rap parody. My level be extraterrestrial, so tread carefully. Yup, still hot, still got the fire flame flavor, can't stop, won't stop. Jurin a real problem on the mic, blast off. When I rock it, I ain't 5'9", but this little giant knows what's really than hip-hop. Still getting hotter, must be a hard pill to swallow,
Fire, 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 fire. Last but not least, we have the amazing Kokuna, Dirt Off Your Shoulder, which is a beat used by Jay-Z. This should be the final one, or like rapping wise. Then we got the singing ones for the rest of the members. But Kokuna, Dirt Off Your Shoulder. Let's go.
If you're feeling like a boss, go and wash your shoulders off. Ladies be big bosses, go and wash your shoulders off. When they be talking crazy, don't forget your girl. Told you get that dirt off your shoulder. Go ahead and call me Kokona. Come at me however you want. Now you wanna be seen to half me like Thanos stepping over my shoulder. Probably got more than 99 problems, but it's time I came and saw conquer. Then put it on repeat like an encore. Put it on repeat, encore. Yeah, best rapper alive. Gotta be tough, fight for that. With my ex love for me life. Got the end past it my way. Haters, eaters, they go get their feelings. Wishing for a reply. All this media boss going over their head like a Rockefeller to sky. Am I a gift and a curse? For the culture when I sweat with these words. Could it hurt you? Cause every time you go hit different, these birds are multiversal. Come take a look.
Her rapping ability is super good, and this beat is crazy. If you haven't heard the original, just type in Jay-Z Dirt Off Your Shoulder and like listen to this beat. It's just crazy. I'm happy she picked this. Well, she always does a good job, like with the beats that she decides to rap over. So, but this beat, and she's amazing at rapping, but like this beat is also crazy.
Told you get that dirt off your shoulder. Go ahead and call me Kokona. Come at me however you want. Now you wanna be seen to half me like Thanos stepping over my shoulder. Probably got more than 99 problems, but it's time I came and saw conquer. Then put it on repeat like an encore. Put it on repeat, encore. Yeah, best rapper alive. Gotta be tough, fight for that. With my ex love for me life. Got the end past it my way. Haters, eaters, they go get their feelings.
There's a lot of Jay-Z reference in
that
she mentioned it.
For the culture when I sweat with these words. Could it hurt you? Cause every time you go hit different, these birds are multiversal. Come take a look at a blueprint. Actually,
Blueprint, Jay-Z album.
If you're feeling like a boss, go and wash your
That's what I like about Kokuna, or you want to call it Coco. Whenever she do these songs, like she pays homage to the person who like beat or like song she using or whatever. So like they, she like really, she just pays homage to like she rapping over the beat or whatever. So you hear a lot of Jay-Z references like albums and like stuff he done said before in this song, because that's what this like beat and like song is known for. So you just paying respect. If you don't pay respect or if you don't mention a person name, people gonna say you like you just like stealing the beat or whatever. You know how people is. So
wishing for a reply. All these media boss going over their head like a Rockefeller to sky. Am I a gift and a curse? For the culture when I sweat with these words. Could it hurt you? Cause every time you go hit different, these birds are multiversal. Come take a look at a blueprint. Actually, lucrative movement. See to the Izzo, and to the Izzo, always ready to show proof. If you're feeling like a boss, go and wash your shoulders off. Ladies be big bosses, go and wash your shoulders off. When they be talking crazy, don't forget your girl. So you get that dirt off your shoulder. You gotta get that dirt off your shoulder. You gotta get that dirt off your shoulder. You gotta get that dirt off your shoulder. Better get that dirt off Kokona.
Alright, that was XG tape for Dirt Off Your Shoulder, Kokona. Really dope. I really like these XG tapes. All of them did an amazing job with this one. This one a little bit different because this was like the let me know in the comment section if you guys like the vertical, like these vertical video formats, or you think they should go back to like the older ones. I believe it's the full screen if I remember right. Yeah, I don't think this was like first one I've seen like vertical. Cause the only other one that was for vertical I think was the girl gang video. I think I did, but let me know if you guys like this format, like vertical that they did, or if not, in the comment section. If you're new, make sure to subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. This is the XG tapes. I'm also going to do a reaction to the song they put out, but that'll be a separate video, so be on the lookout for that. And I'll see you guys in the next video.